Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. On the most basic level, the much talked about normalization between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Israel is already here. It is being considered publicly as a natural extension of Middle East realities, and rather than generating a violent Muslim, Arab, or Palestinian reaction against Riyadh, as would have been feared years ago, it is now accepted as a given, with a difference between denormalization and formalization, depending on the price paid by the parties. With the latest chapter in this plot being written in the double corridor scheme announced last week in India, and boldly mentioning Israel as a partner in a Saudi-sponsored transportation and energy deal, let's explore this issue and ramifications hereof. With us, all the way from central Israel, is Brigadier General in Reserve Yossi Kuperwasser, who is the Project Director on Middle East Developments at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Thank you for joining us, General.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
Also joining us from central Israel is retired Colonel Dr. Eran Lerman, who is a co-host of TV7's Middle East Review, a Powers in Play panelist, and the Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you for joining us as well, sir.
Good to be with you again.
Also joining us, of course, as ever, Mr. Amir Oren. And Amir, I promised you more time at the beginning of today's program. After last week, we were unable to grant you the final say. Saudi Arabia and Israel have had not public relations for quite some time. There have been a couple of attempts over the years to try and check whether or not normalization was in store for those two countries. Nevertheless, in contrast to other Arab states, which Israel had the opportunity to forge the Abraham Accords with, Saudi Arabia was active in various campaigns against Israel, including in the Yom Kippur War and other wars, which brought about quite devastation here in Israel. Nevertheless, we ended up emerging victorious, at least. So that was the good part of the deal. Where are we heading with this? Is this a reality that truly is about to come to play in the next couple of months?
Let me briefly mention two little-known facts about the Saudi-Israeli relationship. In 1950, a right-wing Herut party member of Knesset publicly said that the islands of Tiran and Sanafir are empty and that he doesn't see any need for Israel to concede them. Why doesn't Israel send its shipping through the Straits of Tiran, which is something that Israel did try to do clandestinely. Because of this speech, Saudi Arabia gave Egypt these islands, and they became the bone of contention for both 1956, in a way, and certainly for 1967. Another point, I happen to be the only one here in this panel who used to open my window at Eilat when I grew up there in the early 60s and see Saudi Arabia. Because at that time, before 1965, the Saudi-Jordanian border, not far from Aqaba, was quite adjacent to the Israeli port of Eilat. Later they changed it, they exchanged parcels of territory so that Jordan was given something along the coast of the Red Sea, and Saudi Arabia was given something in the desert east of that. What we have now, instead of Ibn Saud, the ancient ruler between the 1930s and the 1950s, the one who met Franklin Delano Roosevelt on the USS Quincy in the Bitter Lake in 1945, we have another bin, Mohammed bin Salman. And obviously, he doesn't really care about the history which I just recounted. He looks forward to 2030 and beyond. And it's all a matter of interests and priorities. Mohammed bin Salman wants to achieve several things. Israel can either directly or indirectly give him access to these things through its leverage on the U.S. administration and other positions. If Israel comes forward and at least meets him halfway, we have the makings of a deal. If not, it will probably wait for another composition of an Israeli cabinet.
General Kuperwasser, I'd like to ask you this question initially. When we're looking at the political climate here in Jerusalem, as well as the political climate in Washington, D.C., with President Biden, of course, running for re-election in 2024, do you see such a treaty between Washington and Riyadh within context, of course, of U.S. Overseeing or brokering also normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, a viable reality at this stage?
Yes, I think it's very conducive to progress in the relations, maybe even normalization deal with full diplomatic relations, because all the politicians involved need some achievements. And first of all, as you mentioned, President Biden needs achievements before he enters the race for the White House for 4 more years. Netanyahu definitely needs achievements in his foreign policy, mired with the problems at home. And Ben Salman as well is interested in achievements that will cover some bad relations he had with the Americans for a long time, that forced him to do all kinds of things that were not to the liking of the US. So yes, there is a political incentive here. But I think it goes much beyond just the political incentive. It goes along with the ideologies and the needs of the countries. Because Israel can help Saudi Arabia achieve its vision, to see its vision perform, the 2030 vision. We can help with technology. We can help with security. We can help with transportation. We can help with so many issues. Look at the Red Sea security issue, where we should cooperate. Not only we can, but we should cooperate. We are both in CENTCOM now, so we have the will and the tools to cooperate, and we can do that, and that's good for everybody, and it's good for the Americans because they need to see China moving out, and this deal may help them push China a little bit away from Saudi Arabia and from the region. So also from this point of what can be gained by such progress, we can point to that as well. So it's in everybody's interests. I'm saying that because it's in everybody's interests, people try to raise the price because they believe that the other guy really wants it, so they can get more than what he is ready to give. And that's where all kinds of obstacles come in, like the Palestinian issue, which is not a big obstacle right now, I think, but may turn into some temporary obstacle. And there is this issue of the Saudi wish to have a nuclear program, a civilian nuclear program, but that would include the capability to enrich uranium that Israel is concerned with. And not only Israel, but definitely Israel is worried about. And so there are some hurdles that have to be overcome. But basically, I think we are moving in this direction. And even if we are not going to reach full diplomatic relations, there's going to be an improvement in the relations. I heard the Saudi ambassador to the United States, Princess Rima, speaking about focusing on integration of Israel into the Middle East and integration of the relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia as a lower level of goal to be achieved in this respect. Maybe we can start with that, but eventually we shall have normal relations. That's what I believe.
At least it's a change from Prince Bandar's position on Israel, which was nothing less than hostile. But I'd like to ask you, Dr. Lerman, when we're looking at the various demands that the Saudis have put to the Americans with regard to prospective normalization with Israel, General Kuperwasser already mentioned the Palestinian and the nuclear angle, which I think we should delve in more deeply in a couple minutes. But there are two other aspects, and that is a defense treaty of sorts, and sales of sophisticated weaponry that may or may not challenge Israel's qualitative edge in the region, and of course will ratchet up and bolster Saudi Arabia quite substantively in the face of threats which are, of course, common threats with Israel, namely the Islamic Republic of Iran. Do you see this reality being sold in Congress and the Senate, which obviously before elections are not so keen on supporting President Joe Biden for re-election, which would, of course, grant him a great win, and that is something that the Republican Party at least would not want to see?
Okay, let's start with arms sales, which is relatively manageable from an Israeli point of view, as long as it activates the QME rule, basically, which is written into US law, requiring the United States to offer Israel, let's call it, mitigations of the consequences of such sales to countries which are not hostile to Israel, but could potentially emerge under certain circumstances as a risk or a threat. And therefore, this was at work in the context of F-35s to the UAE, and it will be a workable, a complicated but workable proposition when it comes to Saudi Arabia. The treaty question is a far more complicated one, because much hinges on whether or not the Republicans would line up behind such a proposition. A tough challenge for the administrations, clearly because of the reason you mentioned, that they are not keen to give Biden a major achievement on a silver plate. It may end up having to await the dynamics of the political situation, because if Trump dominates the Republican scene and decides to swing behind such a proposition, the politics of it could change dramatically. Otherwise, I find it very difficult to see how 67, the necessary two-thirds majority, could be obtained for a treaty. But there are, short of a treaty, there are, of course, quite a lot of actions that can be taken under the executive privilege of the presidency, short of a defense treaty with Saudi Arabia. If Israel comes to the aid of the administration in a big way, because we have achieved our own goals in this context, it could help. We bear in mind that support in Congress for Israel is still very wide. It was tested in the House recently, not in the Senate, but in the House, and with fairly spectacular results. I think Pramila Jayapal actually voted against her own statement, so she's not left behind, 412 to 9 in favor of denouncing Israel, comparison of Israel to nasty regimes elsewhere. So basically, if Israel is content, it could swing, it could come in and help. Which brings us to the core issue of whether or not what we are going to be asked on the Palestinian question is going to be something that the present Israeli government can deliver on. That's an open question. And I don't think the Saudis or even the Palestinians think in terms of conflict resolution. But they understand that this is not in the cards. But there will be requests having to do with improving the relationship, with different modes of conflict management, with certainly the avoidance of an escalating cycle of violence between Israel and the Palestinians, which would then make it very difficult for the Saudis to buy into the deal. And so this is a delicate question. We cannot ignore the fact that while MBS, I believe, Mohammed bin Salman, cares very little for the present Palestinian leadership, and many Saudis have not forgotten the betrayal of Arafat in 1991 and other issues that have arisen over the years. But still, the Saudis, young Saudis, have been raised on a diet of anti-Israel hatred, and it's not going to be easy for MBS to get, to push through, despite his immense powers, if there isn't something there that he can point to, in much the same manner in which the United Arab Emirates pointed to the abandonment of the annexation plans on the eve of the Abraham Accords.
Of course, that same generation that grew up on anti-Israel sentiments are not the same generation that was privy to the Palestinian betrayal of the kingdom, and therefore they're not really prone to those sentiments particularly. But I'd like to ask you also, General Kuperwasser, on this same front, do you share that assessment on the nuclear as well as the weaponry and the defense pact for that?
Yes, I think that, first of all, coming back to the nuclear issue, I really think that Saudi Arabia has no need for enrichment capability. This is a principle of Israel to see that nobody in the region has the capability to enrich uranium. If we agree with the notion that Saudi Arabia should have it, it's going to be much more difficult for us to claim that Iran shouldn't have it. And I think that neither of them should have it, and nobody else. And that's, I think, is something that is going to stand between us and an agreement if the Saudis insist. I hope they will come to the senses and understand that there's so much to gain and get out of this deal that insisting on this part of the deal is not worth it. And maybe they just put it in order to get better results on the other issues as a bargaining chip. But on the other issues, yes, I think that when it comes to the defense pact and to the weaponry, there can be found ways to overcome the Saudi demands. For them, it's not easy. They have developed such frustration with the United States that for them to move back to the United States, they need to be convinced that they gain something that is lasting. And that's why they need things that would stay in their disposal for a long time. And a pact that is being approved by 67 members of the Senate is something that is going to last. And that's why for them it's so important. The Palestinian issue, in my mind, it is important for the Saudis, but I agree with Iran that this is not going to be the major issue. They will need to show some goodies that they got out of it, just like the Emiratis did. And it's important for them for its own merit. It's not that it's just a tool in the negotiations, but they understand that a solution for the conflict is not in the horizon, and what they can gain for the Palestinians is something limited. And the more important thing is that even the Palestinians understand it. The Palestinians didn't ask for the moon. They may have asked things that Israel has difficulties to provide, but this is not the moon. And I think we should be able to find a way that, and this is more important for the Americans, by the way, than it is important for the Saudis, because for the Americans to gain the support of the left side of the Democratic Party, after everything that they think of MBS, they need to have something in the Palestinian part of the deal, and they can get something, not the moon, as I said.
Indeed. Well, it does seem, however, that the Americans are serious about this, sending, of course, Brett McGurk from the National Security Council, the White House for that matter, as well as Barbara Leaf just recently to Saudi Arabia for meetings that particularly also had to do with Tim Lenderking, if I'm not mistaken, was there also for the Yemeni issue, and others were also involved. But ultimately, it seems like there is a whole of government not necessarily commitment, but a certain investment to try and see whether this is possible as a reality. But I'd like to touch base on last week's G20 summit, where there was the Green Corridor Agreement, of course, major infrastructure that would then, from India, go through Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, the Kingdom of Jordan, Israel, and then from there through Cyprus to Greece. This is something that happened without a normalization agreement, and yet Saudi Arabia was more than keen on seeing this reality evolve. How do you see this entangled with everything being made in order to try and reach a certain peace deal?
The political windfall ascribed to President Biden from an agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia is probably overblown. What will decide whether American voters re-elect Biden or not will be his age, which can hardly be shaped by the Saudis or anyone else on earth, by the economy, by the general view of Biden by the electorate, and whether or not he has some foreign policy achievement in the Middle East, this will probably be overtaken by events much later. Yes, it's a plus, but it's a small plus. Regarding the corridor, this is obviously a response to the Road and Belt initiative by the Chinese. The Americans are saying, along with the Indians and the others, we also have an idea regarding transportation, infrastructure, telecommunications. So it's not only government to government, it's business, it's corporations, it's banks lending money. It's quite a huge undertaking. And yes, as you said, the important detail here is that the Saudis have shared the communique, which explicitly put Israel among the beneficiaries or the parties to the scheme. This is another small step in their road to normalization.
Not so small. It's quite significant.
It's a small verbatim step. When we see it happening, it will be a giant step. But we should always remember that stability in the region has two parts, just like the 1991 Desert Storm, which took part with Soviet acquiescence, Syrian and Egyptian divisions, led to the Madrid Conference. An Israeli, an Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli peace will be part and parcel of a larger regional pacification.
Indeed. This next question I'd like to ask both of you. We don't have very much time left, but before I do ask this question, I'd like to take this opportunity also to congratulate Miri Eisen, Colonel Eisen, who used to host here and took part in many of our panels, was appointed the new director of the ICT conference and ICT Institute, for that matter. And I'd like to start with you, General Kuperwasser. Earlier this week, during the ICT conference, we had the Mossad director, David Barnea, speak to the conference. And during his address, he mentioned the Chinese broker normalization agreement between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran as a temporary reality. Of course, speaking also about the implications of such an arrangement. He sees this as counterproductive to both Saudi Arabia and China, for that matter. But what can you tell us about that? Do you expect China to become more emboldened if Saudi Arabia were to normalize relations with Israel, or will this deter it?
I think that Iran is gaining strength in the Middle East, and this idea of having an agreement between us and the Saudis is there in order to confront this reality. But so far, even if this is temporary arrangement, it's the arrangement, and it's gaining strength for the for the Iranians, and this goes along with the fact that nobody does anything about their progress on the nuclear front and many other regional contexts. And this is what worries me most. I hope that we shall find a way to stop this development soon enough before they manage to break out to having a nuclear weapon. But even now, the situation is really worrying, and this is what Barnea said, and this is what Minister Gallant said, and they are right. There's a growing threat to Israel and to Saudi Arabia from Iran, even though there is this cover of better relations. Even the Saudis don't get it wrong. They understand that they can improve the relations with Iran, but still be very suspicious about what are the real Iranian goals.
Indeed. Dr. Lerman, 40 seconds.
I believe that the Saudis were signaling by way of this signing ceremony in Beijing that they are really worried about the American level of commitment. And perhaps they are raising a question about Israel's level of commitment given Israel's own domestic concerns and so on. So it's a very important set of signals from Biden on one hand in India saying, we see you as a partner in countering the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And some very important signals from the whole range of the Israeli defense establishment saying we are taking the Iranian threat to us and to you very seriously. I think all of this contributes to the creation of the right atmosphere for moving forward.
Indeed. Mr. Oren, one sentence?
Well, the very fact that we are normalizing the conversation, and the Saudis have, this is quite a signal that normalization is on the way, whether it will be sooner, Sunni, Shiite, or later, remains to be seen.
Well, that's all the time there are for today. I'd like to thank General Kuperwasser, Dr. Lerman, and Mr. Oren for being part of today's panel. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until next time, from here in Jerusalem, Shalom.